My body, my choice. France became the world's first country to enshrine abortion rights in its constitution. The bill was approved in an overwhelming majority during a rare joint session at the Versailles, convened for the first time in 16 years. This while women's right to choose is shaping up to be a key issue in the upcoming U.S. presidential election, following a few rulings that largely rolled back the country's abortion rights. To tell us more about the reignited debate over women's right to choose and its possible impact on Korea, we're now joined by Celio Fioretti, Seoul correspondent at Croix, in the studio. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
We're also accompanied by Lee Hee-eun, Associate Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School this evening. Welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me.
Celio, I want to start with you. So France is now the world's first to offer explicit protection for termination of pregnancy in its basic law. But abortion rights have been around. It's been legal in France since 1975. So why put that in the Constitution? What changes would it bring?
Speaking of a right to abortion in the Constitution is a bit of a shortcut, actually. To be exact, it's a bit more tricky than this. What has been voted and added to the Constitution is the freedom to get an abortion, which means the Constitution guarantees every French woman that no one will block an abortion. That doesn't really change the law that was voted in 1975. Think of this new amendment as a way to protect abortion and to make it more difficult to remove it if another government wanted to do that. It's quite important to specify the difference with a right to abortion. If it was a right, it would mean the government had to guarantee every woman access to a doctor and a facility to get an abortion, which is not the current case in France. For example, 17% of women have to change region to get an abortion because there's no qualified doctors in their region. Feminist associations have requested this idea of making it a right, but it would have been quite difficult to really enforce that for the government, so they choose to make it a freedom to get an abortion, which is still quite a victory because it will make it more difficult for any government to roll back.
Right, exactly. So once it's enshrined in the Constitution, above all else, it'll be extremely difficult to walk back on it, right? Which is obviously why many French activists and supporters of abortion rights, and also the majority of French lawmakers, have forged ahead and put it in the Constitution. Now to you, Professor Hee-eun. The landmark passage of the bill came after the U.S. Supreme Court's 2022 decision to reverse the famous Roe v. Wade ruling that guaranteed women's access to abortion. Tell us more about the U.S. ruling and how it impacted France.
So in 2018, a law was passed in Mississippi that basically prevented all abortions, with some exceptions, basically after 15 weeks of pregnancy. And so there was an abortion provider in Mississippi that sort of challenged this law. And as a result, because of the challenge to this law made its way through the Mississippi courts, and then eventually to the federal courts in the United States, where it now ended up in the Supreme Court. And so the case then rested on this single question, on questions of Mississippi law, was that whether banning abortions after 15 weeks was unconstitutional. And so now the court famously now has decided to overturn Roe versus Wade and say that basically the Constitution doesn't confer a right to abortion. Now, it doesn't mean that abortion is illegal. It just says that under federal law in the United States Constitution, since the Constitution doesn't guarantee abortion, that means this issue should go back to the states. So individual states will now make their own laws, whether either to ban abortions or to allow them. And so basically, it will go back to each state to make that decision. So ironically, This is exactly in some part what the French were doing in terms of making a constitutional amendment in terms of the parliament making this decision. So basically, the Supreme Court is telling the United States that this will go back to the legislative branch of each state to make that decision. So what's happening here is essentially is no constitutional right to abortion, but this issue should go back to the legislatures of each state to make that decision.
I'm glad that you highlighted that point because it's a little bit confusing. So what the U.S. Supreme Court did was not to pass an abortion ban of its own, but give the power back to individual states. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated, and it's also one of the reasons why abortion issue will be one of the key issues in the upcoming U.S. elections. But could you elaborate a little bit more about how the ruling impacted France?
So in reaction to this, then the French, I'm given to understand, is that the French parliament particularly was very interested in watching very closely what was happening in the United States. So a number of parliamentarians publicly declared that because there was a rollback in abortion rights in the United States, that basically that this will then sort of motivated the French, in this case, the legislative branch again, to sort of come up with a overwhelming majority to establish this constitutional right within France. So in some sense, you could say that this was a direct reaction to what was happening in the United States to then make this constitutional right within the French Constitution.
There's definitely a direct link there. Right now to you, Celio. France's move to make abortion rights a constitutional right has reignited a worldwide debate on the issue of abortion. Now, as we've briefly spoken with Dr. Hee-eun, while we saw some major rollbacks on abortion rights in the U.S., how are other European countries viewing women's right to abortion?
Well, every country in the European Union allow abortion since Malta legalized it in 2023. But every country in the Union has its own law, so the abortion right can vary depending on the country. 25 of the 27 states of the Union legalized abortion without any condition, in general until 12 weeks after the start of pregnancy. Some countries, such as Ireland, really moved drastically on the matter. Before 2013, a woman that got an abortion in Ireland could face up to 14 years of prison. The country changed its law in 2013 and 2018 to make it legal without any condition. Nowadays, there's only 2 countries that remain with restrictive abortion, which is Poland and Malta. In Poland, for example, abortion is authorized only in case of rape or if it threatens the life of the mother. The country tried to totally ban abortion in 2016, but failed to do so. But as we have seen in the US, there's quite a trend of rolling back on abortion rights. It's not only Poland, actually. Many countries such as Hungary, Portugal, Slovakia has tried and sometimes succeed in restricting the abortion right, making it more expensive to get one or making it a very long process. So this kind of conservative trend is also happening in the European Union. And thus, recently there was a proposition supported by France to put the right to abortion into the European Charter of Rights. This Charter of Rights is enforceable in every country of the Union, so they would have to comply with it. The text hasn't been voted yet. It's also an idea to make it a right for abortion in all of the European Union. The text hasn't been voted, it's still in debate, but the French President Emmanuel Macron has said he will fight for it.
Well, 25 states out of 27, that's an impressive number, isn't it? And there are only very few countries like Malta and Poland, as you've pointed out, that have restrictive abortion policies. I think this speaks volumes about how women's rights and women's freedom is perceived in Europe. I read in numerous articles that the majority of Europeans view abortion ban as a gender-based violence. Am I right?
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
All right, now back to you, Professor Lee. For our viewers who may not be up to date about how South Korea has been handling the issue, walk us through how abortion-related laws have been legislated and amended in the country over the past few decades and where it stands today.
Right. Well, since 1953, South Korea's Criminal Act provided for basically a prohibition on abortion. So basically, if you performed an abortion on any grounds, that's the criminal act. And basically, this law had not been changed for quite some time. And in fact, in the 21st century, in 2005, to basically boost the rate of criminal convictions, there was another law passed by the Korean government, the Framework Act on Low Birth Rate in an Aging Society, basically sort of stepped up enforcement of sort of making abortion criminally prosecutable. But there's been a number of challenges that were presented to the Constitutional Court about the constitutionality of such provisions. And so this was in 2010, a case was brought in Korea to sort of challenge the constitutionality of such criminal law. But in 2012, when the Constitutional Court made its decision, basically the court sort of balanced between the right of the child, the unborn child or the fetus in this case, to their right to life, versus the right of women to an abortion. And so in that decision back in 2012, the court made the decision that the right to life was much more weighed heavily more in favor than the women's rights in this case. But then later on, a number of years, this constitutional challenge was presented again, in 2019, and said basically in that case, in the later case, the Constitutional Court found that such a ban on abortion was now unconstitutional. And so basically ruled now that since the criminal law is unconstitutional, now the National Assembly must now make laws that now clarify this position in this case. And now, since that time, there has been no action really by the National Assembly to pass new laws on abortion. And so therefore, it's been described as a legal gray area because no longer is it criminal, but because there's been no laws that have been set forth by the National Assembly to specify, for example, up to what point can you have an abortion, doctors, people who are potentially want to get an abortion don't know exactly when such abortions can be made. So therefore, it's in legal limbo, as we would say. So therefore, that's the current state of sort of Korean law as we see it now.
So we're kind of in a wishy-washy state, aren't we? Abortion isn't completely illegal nor completely legal. And so the related bill is also stuck in limbo at the National Assembly. But Dr. Lee, Korea also saw a landmark ruling recently. The Constitutional Court has overturned a decades-old law prohibiting fetal sex disclosure. Some are delighted as it'll allow pregnant women to find out if she's having a boy or a girl whenever they want, but some are concerned it may lead to an increased abortion in the country since abortions aren't completely illegal. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, this has been a question, I think, in terms of the motivation for this law, why this law was initially passed, was because in Korean society for a long time, there was a boy preference. And so in that situation, if you have a boy preference and you find out you're going to have a girl, the idea was that that may lead people to sort of abort the female baby in this case. And therefore, we need such laws not to disclose this information because people would be then motivated potentially to abort female babies. And so now, interestingly, this has been widely reported and studied. Korea now has not a boy preference anymore, but actually a girl preference. And so now I think people have been sort of thinking about, well, because if people now have a girl preference generally in society, then the law doesn't really need to be in place because there's no real sort of threat now for people to abort their children if they find out that it's a girl. And so the only concern I think then there would be potentially is if it shifted so much, there's such a great girl preference that people no longer preferred boys anymore, that maybe this will tip the scales against, again, having this law sort of repealed because people will now be motivated to abort boy babies instead of girl babies. But in any event, I think the reason for this has been because of the great shift in Korea between having whether family wants to have a boy or girl, but because now more people generally prefer having girls, the reason for this law to be in place no longer exists. Therefore, the repeal, I think, was being held now in this case because the underlying reasons are gone.
Right, exactly. The Korea's long-standing preference over boys, it's clearly on the decline, especially with the improved conditions of women's socioeconomic status as well. Now, going back to you, Celio, going back to the U.S., an Alabama court has ruled that frozen embryos are children and they should be legally protected like any other child. Can you tell us more about this and its aftermath as well?
Yeah, of course. This decision from the Alabama court created quite a mess in the US. So to go back on that ruling in February, mid-February, it says that embryos for in vitro fertilization are considered children and must be protected as children according to the law. This causes quite trouble, especially for the fertility clinics. Indeed, it's quite frequent for them to destroy embryos if they are not viable or abnormal. But this, according to this ruling, would make them have liability claims because they would be destroying children according to the law. So fearing any legal risk, all fertility clinics in Alabama have stopped their activities. This issue became quite a big issue nationwide, and many politicians, especially Republicans, have been asked to comment on that, and even them criticized this ruling. Joe Biden also qualified it as outrageous and unacceptable. The state administration quickly reacted and created new legislation during the night and voted it, but it's still not clear how yet it will change the situation and how it will protect the clinics and the parents. Now, clinics have said they will resume to their activities, but everyone is still in quite limbo, waiting for any implication of that law and the conflicting two rulings.
Right. As you've pointed out, Alabama governor was quick to react. He was quick to pass a bill protecting Alabama doctors from legal liabilities, but still, various reports indicate that doctors are still hesitant and a bit more reluctant to practice IVFs because it became that much more riskier. Now, back to you, Dr. Lee. Abortion rights are shaping up to be a central issue for both parties in the 2024 U.S. presidential election. How do you foresee the issue playing out until November?
Well, certainly social and moral issues will shape, voters' preferences, right, in terms of an election. However, the issue of abortion has basically crystallized on the Republican side as well as the Democratic Party side. So, most voters, I think, have already made their decisions based on whether they will vote Republican or Democrat. And I don't think abortion will change anyone's minds because basically, if you're for abortion, you're going to vote for the Democrats. If you're sort of against abortion, you're going to vote Republican. But, really in the United States right now, at the top of the minds of most voters is not really abortion. If you look at statistics and reporting, basically abortion doesn't even make the top 5 list of voter concerns, right? The most important concern for most people is going to be the economy, jobs, inflation, anything that relates to their wallets. And then another big issue that's really come to the fore in the United States election will be immigration as well. So, while abortion will be talked about, and maybe some candidates and this will be an issue in the media, I think for most people, it's really not a great sort of big issue for them because they've already made their choices based on the party's platform on abortion, either Republican or Democrat.
Right. It all boils down to the economy, doesn't it? It all boils down to the money. Now, before we let you go, Professor Hee-eun, one last question for you. How would the rekindled global controversy over abortion rights impact Korea? And in your view, in which direction should the country's discussions be headed?
Right. There's a real fundamental divide in Korea about, of course, people who insist that abortion issue should be viewed within the context of women's rights, and of course, on the other side, who insisted to view the issue in the context of the right of the life of the child, of the unborn baby. So there's a very fundamental divide in this country on that question, as there is in other places where this is a great debate. But so I suspect that, given the low birth rate in Korea now, the public discussion will be about how we need to encourage Korean families to have more children through basically economic and social incentives. And the abortion debate will probably be wrapped up as part of that discussion. But really, what I hope sincerely is that in the midst of all of this, that there will be some talk about how children are not just to be viewed in the context of a dwindling population, but that children are really a blessing to families and to the Korean nation. And that life isn't simply about calculating numbers and statistics, but about the real relationships that exist in our society. So my hope is that we get beyond the numbers and we should have a really honest discussion about the meaning of children in Korean society.
Right, really candid and active discussions. They're important for just about any matter, any topic, right? Very valuable discussions we had tonight. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of this show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.